Indigenous feminism is intersectional, right? It looks at the intersections of these various systems of power and the operations of power. We see our struggles as interconnected, right? It's relational, and that we see our struggles as interconnected with one another, not just other Indigenous women, but queer folks, folks who are struggling, facing similar struggles towards justice and accountability within their own contexts. We see our own liberation not just as a sort of individualistic pursuit, but as intertwined with other liberatory struggles where there are convergences in our goals, right? So there's two really important elements that you touched on there, right? The intersectionality and the relationality. These struggles aren't just existing in isolation or in a vacuum. All right, I'm going to just put up these are really basic points, and you don't have to write them all down, but I always build off Bell Hook's definition of feminism because of how expansive and inclusive it is. Recognizing that Indigenous feminism is this and more, right? And any, I think, adaptation of Hook's words and work, which is oriented towards, explaining to folks why feminism is literally for everybody, allows us to sort of, find a place within that movement, but then also extend that basic premise to also then look at other forms of racial, capitalist, ableist, classist oppression, right? Forms that fuse with sexism, forms of power and marginalization. So Hooks writes that feminism is a movement to end sexism, sexist exploitation, and oppression. And I do think that is a really good core, for me at least, on my reading of feminism. And I want to start by, this part of the conversation just by recognizing that there are so many feminisms that exist. And in fact, one of the first questions someone asked me about the edited book that I just put together was, why did you call it Making Space for Indigenous Feminism singular? Right, rather than plural. And I think it's a really important question because even within the book, there are diverse experiences, lived experiences and embodiments of feminism, while also recognizing, I think it's important for the visibility of the scholarly theory and the practice of feminism to be able to generalize some overarching insights that are shared and some qualities that are shared by the various strands of Indigenous feminism. Right? And so for me, it's not about just kind of reducing it to one singular definition that people have to ascribe to. Indigeneity is diverse. People are diversely situated, right? Feminists with decolonial or anti-racist commitments are diversely situated. So we'll see feminism in a different way and comprehend it and understand it in the world around them in diverse ways. Right? So it's not about reducing it to one singular definition. However, there are still people who will deny that there is an intellectual tradition or theory of work as Indigenous feminism. So it's really important to sort of crystallize and be able to trace that genealogy of knowledge, right? To give it scholarly legitimacy and some sort of really cohesiveness among the various works and strands of feminism that people are putting forward. Within the book, we recognize plural forms of feminism, understandings of feminism, and worlds that people are sort of envisioning and trying to work towards within their own approaches. But yeah, I often start from the Bell Hooks definition, and then I have just a few notes here on the various qualities of Indigenous feminism specifically. So I talked a little bit yesterday about how, particularly in the Canadian context, Indigenous feminism emerges in response largely to the efforts of the Canadian state to regulate the transmission of Indigenous identity, right? Saying early on with the Indian Act who is or is not an Indian and who is going to be able to gain Indian status, and also how they're going to gain that status. This is where I see a lot of the origins of Indigenous feminism in Canada versus, let's say, the United States, where it emerges through different conversations around borders, carcerality, violence, incarceration, and also, violence against Indigenous women as a sort of inherent part of colonialism, right? So in the US in particular, we've seen a lot of work around, tracing that relationship between individual bodies and what those bodies represent, right? That those bodies represented Indigenous life, Indigenous sovereignty, Indigenous jurisdiction, and that these were aspects of Indigenous life or components of Indigenous life that were targeted for elimination through colonialism. So you see Audra Simpson's work, particularly her work on Teresa Spence, arguing along those lines, and a lot of other feminist authors really making those connections between bodies of land and water that are targeted for violence through colonialism, and Indigenous people's bodies, and how that then genders the whole project of colonialism and can be understood in that way. So a lot of Indigenous feminism in Canada, just moving back to this context, actually emerges a bit differently. It emerges through struggles against colonial legislation around identity as well. But that, that could be an Indigenous resistance movement sort of writ large, where the feminist component of that, or the feminist sort of character of that emerges, is also when we see Indian Act Indigenous governments that have sort of internalized some of these notions of gender, these narrow and restrictive and binary notions of gender, and start to also police Indigenous women's movements in particular ways, right? So we see Indigenous governments trying to articulate claims to representation and regulate Indigenous women's identities in ways as well, in addition to Canada, right? So there's these multiple forms of power and oppression at play. And Indigenous women who are arguing both against the state, but also in some contexts against their own communities, are starting to articulate much more intersectional critiques, right? To build off of their particular location as exited Indian women, right? Women who have been declined their status, who have had that status removed, and who are in a position where they can't transmit it to their children. So that's where we start to see interventions that are focused on the particular positionality of Indigenous women, and particularly Indigenous women who now reside, or at the time historically resided, outside of their communities. Many have been reinstated since. It's Indigenous feminism, like many feminisms, is focused on power relations and systems, particularly systems of male power and privilege and how they operate, increasingly focused on the effects of heteronormative patriarchy. And so not just trying to reinforce those gender categories, but also within our analyses, trying to think through them in more fluid and robust ways, right? How male power and privilege will implicate diversely situated members of our community who may or may not ascribe to the category of woman. This is a big debate in the new edition of Making Space, right? And this is a big debate for decades now. I used to work at the Women's Center at UVic, and we talked a lot about 2 decades ago, moving to a gender equity center. And a lot of those advocacy groups have, right, gender inclusivity centers, and have started to, gender studies programs have renamed themselves, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with those conversations. For me, I think it's important to acknowledge the changes in vocabulary, the changes in how we're conceptualizing who Indigenous feminism is for, and those were some of the questions I was trying to really raise in Making Space 3, and trying to revisit some of our own, the sort of foundations and assumptions that the movement grew from. Right? So this involved a lot of really challenging conversations with older generations of feminists about how they understand the category of woman, who they see Indigenous feminism as for, whose concerns and lived experiences do we need to be attending to within this movement. And we still call it Indigenous feminism as of now, and focus again on various forms of gender and sex-based oppression. Would also recognize that we continue to be in a society that's marked by male power and privilege, both within Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities. And so we still need a mode of analysis that can deconstruct and hopefully attend to those power relations without actively reproducing the sort of narrow nature of those categories themselves, right? While also continuing to problematize whether these are still effective ways of talking about power and oppression, and being fluid and willing to revisit those conversations on an ongoing basis. I mean, often Indigenous feminists will affect critiques of governance structures when they're male-dominated and entail kind of concentrations of power and privilege. But again, it's hard to kind of generalize because there are women chiefs that are leading some of those bad council structures. There are women chiefs that are in hereditary positions of power as well. So what I always really encourage, particularly with a feminist approach, is contextuality, like a deep contextuality, rather than a sort of universality. Well, I think it's important that we can draw out shared insights and, remarks and observations as academics. I do think that, there's over 600 Indigenous communities in Canada. Like it's very, very hard. And some have hundreds of years of experience grappling with colonial structures, down east. Others have more recent experiences. Others, in the north, haven't had the same necessary influx of settler communities as, let's say down east where there's been colonizers since 1700s, right? So I actually think that a lot of the theories are really challenging to sort of just try and apply in a kind of surface level way. You really have to go into depth with the localized political culture of that community. But certainly those would be, targets of critique for when they're seeing abuses of power and resources and concentrations of power and resources. Yeah, so it's focused on revealing, illuminating power relations and systems. Often this means, particularly in the context of academia, talking back to your own discipline, right? Responding to your own discipline and talking about the ways in which it needs to decolonize, indigenize, or conversely, be more attentive to gender and sexuality. As an Indigenous feminist, for 1 year I taught at the University of Manitoba, both in Native Studies and Women and Gender Studies, and it was interesting. It was kind of the opposite tasks I had to do with each department, right? Talk about women and gender studies, talk to them about race and coloniality, and in Native Studies, still making the case for why an analysis of gender and sexuality is important. So often, when you're using an intersectional approach, it involves, in the initial phases, just kind of talking back to and responding to existing disciplinary orientations, canons, assumptions, and things like that, right? And then you can really, start to get into a little bit more fun of a project, which could entail some of the following approaches. Often it involves centering women's voices and experiences, right? Really trying to resituate and relocate Indigenous women as central, not just writ large, but central to XYZ, especially in the academy, right? So in my discipline in political science, it involves, not just counting the number of women in politics and talking about how we need to increase those numbers, but actually thinking about, okay, who do we see as proper political actors? What do we see as the important political ideas? And are those gendered? Are those masculinist? Are we prioritizing within our discourses and our inquiries ideas that are of central concern to Indigenous people writ large? Or how can we bring those concerns that Indigenous women are foregrounding to the center of our discipline? How can we scale up our response to those things that are often seen as just personal or interpersonal concerns? Right? So revisiting political actors, for me, again, you can think about this in the context of your work, political ideas, what we look at as political institutions, right? Is the land and the river, are these sites of politics? Are they political actors, right? Are relatives, are non-human relatives? I do a lot of work on the Buffalo Treaty. How do we see the buffalo as someone with political agency in these relations that we're talking about, not just as subjects of the relation, but as active agents in the relation? And how do we engage those ideas, right? What do we see as political institutions? Are we just looking at the quote unquote formal sites? Or are we thinking about politics that exists in the everyday, right? At the interpersonal level, in our everyday relations? So those are some of the things that, just for instance, in my own field, I have to revisit when I'm thinking about centering women's voices and experiences. Centering them not just generally by relaying them, and redescribing particularly experiences of violence. This is something that you'll see a lot, right? Especially in courses where people are coming to the course matter not having heard much about Canada and Indigenous people other than residential schools and missing and murdered women, right? There's two things that a lot of people will have heard about. And I often, when I teach gender and feminism, I purposefully have started to avoid using a blue sky approach when letting people choose their topics, because I find that a lot of people will navigate to those two topics without necessarily reflecting on or thinking about why they're interested in writing about gendered violence against women, Indigenous women, why they're so keen to focus on Indigenous women's bodies as subjects of inquiry, and whether they would be as willing to think about their own gender, sexuality, or embodiment as a subject of inquiry for people to just choose, and decide to take up as part of their MA or doctoral research. And so I'll hand out long lists of various topics that people could choose with respect to gender and sexuality, and I often include a caveat. If you are going to write on MMIW or you're going to write on gendered violence, I want you to explain why, right? Tell me why and what you hope to do with this. Because what I try to avoid is a sort of news reporter style of just relaying really traumatic instances, really violent instances on the paper for the purpose of mere redescription, without actually offering or adding to those, or offering to, build some insights into, let's say, how power is working in that particular situation, right? I think it's okay to choose those topics if you're self-reflexive about why you're coming to them, what your stakes are in relation to them, but also what this work is going to do. And so this is something with research methods that, I always start out by having students reflect on their own positionality, of course, do self-location papers, think about also, what their own gifts and contributions could be if they're going to be undertaking activist scholarship, which feminist scholarship is. It's always geared towards transformation. It's always geared towards doing something and achieving some sort of change. So, that starts by getting students to reflect deeply on what it is they have to offer, what their passions are, what drives them, what makes them angry, what makes them more interested or curious. Many of the projects I've worked on have been literally out of sheer frustration and anger from something I was hearing in the news, and then went and wrote an op-ed, and then that turned into a book. And these things kind of build momentum and snowball. And so those affective, kind of triggers could be very important to think about and to try and build on, because that's the sort of thing that will actually drive a project to completion and make it have an impact in the world around us. So I start by getting them to self-locate, thinking about their relation to indigeneity, their lived experience. Maybe they have no relation. That's fine. That's not wrong, right? But just to get them to be kind of deeply reflexive and transparent. And from there to think about, okay, you're interested in talking about X, Y, Z, but what is it that you think you might bring to this? What might this project do, right? I think that's really important. Going back to MMIW, or inquiries into violence against women, I think, there's an interest because it's topical right now. And so it's not saying that, people who just kind of unilaterally choose that topic are doing something malicious. But what I try and prompt them to do is to get them to think a little bit more deeply about what it is they're hoping to achieve, what sorts of structures of power are you going to illuminate, and all of that can be kind of revealed in how they're approaching their research question, really, and their methods, and giving them really concentrated feedback about, okay, you could center women's voices, you could center your own experience, but you could also do that outside of academia. That could be a creative writing project. Like, why do you want to do a PhD with this? What are you hoping to uncover, right? There's a lot of people today that will come to my program and say, well, I'm Indigenous and I want to share my story. And I actually think, I respond to them, like, you can share that story in a creative writing project. Why is it you want to do this in the form of a PhD? Because being Indigenous is not just it's not a credential on its own, right? And sharing your story on its own, yes, that could be a methodology, but it's not, it's an autobiographical narrative on its own, right? There needs to be something you're also hoping to illuminate or reveal or find out through this project, because you're choosing to do it in the wheelhouse of academia, right? And I think, there's still a certain amount of kind of rigor and quality that we need to be able to expect beyond the sort of articulation of an Indigenous perspective or view. There still needs to be something that's happening, that those, maybe the person is writing in creative ways or approaching this unconventionally through their own story or their own narratives, but those narratives still have to orbit around a guiding question, right? That's going to reveal something or help, make connections that weren't there before. That could also be the purpose of a project, but it has to do something. It has to have a purpose. So foregrounding women's voices and experiences, long-winded rant about people that just kind of, want to center voices but don't really know what they're doing with it. I think it's really important to sort of think about that. And those experiences absolutely are illuminating, but about what? On what, right? What are they illuminating? And then obviously critiques colonialism, heteropatriarchy, intersections, including racism, ableism, homophobia, and transphobia. Advancing critiques, right? We all know that feminists are sort of notorious for complaint, grievances, are known, as Sarah Ahmed calls feminists, killjoys, right? And certainly this is what a lot of feminists do, right? Is a person that will raise in meetings, sort of procedural concerns that nobody really wants to grapple with. It's a person that will point out, the elephant in the room that nobody's really naming, or often people don't want to name because they're kind of, it would be a lot easier to not get your hands messy, to not kind of delve into a messy topic that's going to open up a whole can of worms. Well, feminists are the ones that do that, and that see a value in sort of excavating those conflicts in order to perhaps allow them to heal in a more fulsome way, right? Excavating the matters at hand in order to actually engage with them in a critical way and respond to them critically as well. And I'm sure you all have examples in your life that are familiar of feminists or familiar with feminist critiques and analysis. They also entail commitments, and these are not empty commitments, right? These are commitments that are quite robust, and they're not just abstract, right? So you're articulating this commitment to indigeneity or decolonization over here, but then actively reproducing colonial logics over here, right? I'm sure we all know people who do this. People who claim to be, our prime minister claims to be a feminist, right? And open up any news article about how they're responding to Indigenous injustices and oppression today, and you'll see that disconnect, right? It's very common to have a sort of theoretical or claimed commitment, but not enact that in your everyday interactions, and it's much more challenging, to actually reflect on your interactions, be willing to make mistakes, be willing to admit and not get defensive when you have made a mistake, and then try and correct it, right? And so that's something that not all feminists, but what I like to think a feminist ethos should entail, right? Is a willingness to be human, to see others as human. That's part of that relationality, right? Nobody's perfect, and it's not just about being an expert, but actually finding value in those transparent, real conversations between human beings when they're willing to have them. And is concerned with land, histories of land theft and oppression, or that one should actually say dispossession, with cultural and material losses, political subordination, and with the denial of our identity. So these are, this isn't a comprehensive list, but these are some of the matters that Indigenous feminists specifically have taken up in ways that sort of differ from, well, let's just name, what are some broader kind of liberal feminist concerns that come to mind? What are some of the first things that come to mind across the waves of feminism?
Equal pay.
Equal pay, yep. Yep. Childcare, yep. What else?
Reproductive rights.
Sorry? Reproductive rights, absolutely. Yeah, what else?
Getting your
Yep. Parity, social, political, economic parity. Yep. Yeah. Educational, health. Really, all social indicators. Yeah. Gender violence, yeah. So, feminists have a lot to say on really everything, right? You could bring a gendered analysis to any aspects of the social world we reside in, and the political world. Indigenous feminists, absolutely, you could also have an Indigenous feminist analysis of all of those topics, but I think these are some of the topics that people have tended to gravitate towards, particularly given, I mentioned this yesterday, but, Indigenous people's broader concerns with dispossession of land, right? When we talk about relationality and relational practice, a lot of that relates to having the freedom to relate to the land and creation as we once did, right? Or as Leanne Simpson says, as we've always done. Well, you can't do that without access to land, without rights to land, right? Or rights that actually allow you to engage freely with those lands. And so Indigenous political subjecthood or subjectivity is almost always involves a territorial relation or claim. And so land often figures centrally and is sort of implicated in these inquiries in one way or another. All right. So we've gone over some of the qualities of Indigenous feminism here. And methodologically, I know a lot of you have questions about what does an Indigenous feminist approach look like? Well, again, like the topics we just covered, which were only a very small snapshot of some of the feminist concerns that exist, any methodology, I think, it could be approached and adapted to an Indigenous feminist methodology. There isn't one clear set. And so here we have, just an example, images of the range of different approaches that folks have used to sort of offer Indigenous feminist either texts or expressions, right? Through aesthetics, through creative works, Leanne Simpson's Islands of Decolonial Love. Leanne Simpson also offers, scholarly academic theory as well, through, poster campaigns. Up on the top left, I have Hanani K. Trask and her activism in Hawaii, and some of the work that she's done, which is always really grounding to me because Trask really articulates the need to not think of, indigeneity and feminism as these sort of mutually exclusive pursuits, but foregrounds her indigeneity and within that articulates feminist concerns from a very early point, right, in relation to the sovereignty movement in Hawaii. But the other thing I like about Trask is that she really sort of collapses the perceived disconnect between theory and praxis, saying that, for Indigenous people, theory is always grounded, always already grounded somewhere. It's always grounded in these struggles against the colonizer, against patriarchy. There are no two realms that have to be reconnected. And so when you talk, in my field, when I hear people talk a lot about grounding or engaging their theory, having it be either engaged in community or grounded in community, it doesn't always immediately make a lot of sense because for Indigenous scholarship, and particularly Indigenous feminist scholarship, it's always already grounded in a very particular context, right? And so that sort of disconnect doesn't necessarily exist. I'm sure it does, for some who take up more abstract, inquiries into Indigenous political life. But for Indigenous feminism and Indigenous feminist work, it always emerges from a particular somewhere and a particular people and a particular place. And then I have some of the work, these are beaded vamps, and those were part of the installation of moccasin vamps, the Walking with Our Sisters installation. And a poem in the middle by my colleague Leanne Charlie, who does work at Jacintha, which is a Bush university in the north. And Leanne Charlie's work is around collage and around juxtaposing the various sort of seemingly incommensurable aspects of Indigenous life today. So I just wanted to show some of these instances. Again, these aren't comprehensive, but what we're seeing methodologically is a lot of feminists really pushing back against dominant ways of knowing in the academy, right? Pushing back against the sort of ontological and epistemological norms that sort of circulate widely around, also dominant expectations of what scholarship or methods should look like, right? And really taking subversive avenues and subversive methods to either engage their inquiries or offer different expressions or interventions. And so, I think it's important to acknowledge the ways that Indigenous feminists are constantly making space for new approaches and new methods, but also recognizing that Indigenous feminists are doing traditional style scholarship as well all the time, right? That there is a lot of feminist analysis in traditional scholarly form that shouldn't be discounted either. So one of the ways in which Indigenous feminists push back against dominant modes of knowledge production and the sort of universality of the university or the sort of move to approach knowledge as universal, right? As something that could be understood by anyone, engaged by anyone, and then if it's good science, abstracted, extracted, and taken across to other contexts and reproduced, right? That's all embedded in the notion of a universal approach to knowledge production, right? So if we understand knowledge as something that is universal and should be, sort of normatively, it will give rise to, I think, a much different method, approach to inquiry, but then also, different forms of knowledge production and mobilization. Indigenous feminists aren't really concerned with the guise of objectivity. In fact, many push back and try and collapse and argue for situatedness, for standpoint theory, for like critical approaches to one's positionality, and so are always really upfront about where they're coming from, or should be upfront, where they're coming from and how they're approaching an issue, what their relationship is to an issue, and even recognize that that might be partial or incomplete, right? That they're offering a very particular perspective, and they should be clear about their intentions and motivations. Here, I'm thinking of some of the classic sort of early feminist works. And so a lot of this is like how I would read some of the early Indigenous feminist manifestos, particularly ones in Canada that were produced through sort of literary interventions, because that's where we see, a lot of Indigenous women sort of early on articulating their experiences with colonialism and their challenging experiences in communities. And so a lot of this is just, from my readings of things like Indigenous feminist manifestos, which I'm really interested in and I find very useful as a teaching tool, because manifestos are so short and people really have to get to the point in articulating what their concern is, what their area of concern is, what it is that they'd hope to change, how they would go about changing that, and what are the most urgent priorities. So sometimes I'll have students do personal manifestos, sometimes I'll have them do collective manifestos and get them to kind of either identify or imagine that they're part of a collective or community and what they would do within that context to change it, to disrupt the status quo or affect a rupture, right, in terms of the worlds that they're envisioning that they want to bring forward. But so a lot of these insights are drawn from those exercises, but they can be brought across, I think, to other readings of feminist texts as well. So intended to provoke change and to be transformative, right? There's supposed to be something happening. There's supposed to be something that you're doing with this work to have an impact and express urgency, articulate ruptures, and changes of rules. Right? A lot of what people push back against in terms of feminist work, and particularly Indigenous feminist work, are the really just the, again, to use Sarah Ahmed's words, the walls that they repeat, brick walls that they repeatedly find themselves coming up against, right? I think she says something, and I'm paraphrasing here, about how those walls will be most intimately known to those who frequently come up against them, right? And so coming up against them regularly means that you actually have unique insights into whether there's any holes in them, how you might poke holes in them, how you might take those down, right? And so a lot of the work comes from, very intimate, embodied places that people have been grappling with. So what are those sorts of institutional systems or rules that you want to change, or that you think, in the context of education, what is happening in the system that you're working within that you would like to change, either immediately or in the long term? And then again, meant to kind of communicate and compel people towards those goals, right? They're meant often to be argumentative, persuasive, to show and demonstrate the need for change. Unfortunately, feminists are often, Indigenous feminists particularly, we're 3 editions into this book, 2 decades into making space, but are still just carving out space in many contexts, especially in community level contexts, because a lot of these conversations are coming from academic sites. They're coming from places where people, like-minded people, are advancing the discourse, right? But at a community level, there's still, very strong stigmas in some contexts. Some communities, some Indigenous communities are really doing great work around gender inclusivity, around, inclusivity of non-binary, queer folks, two-spirit folks. Others are still at a much earlier stage, right? And questions just aren't asked, and things just happen because they've always happened that way. And so, again, as academics, when we're going to engage in these contexts, it's very important to be thoughtful, again, not just about being kind of reproducing paternalistic dynamics in your engagements with communities and trying to meet them where they're at in terms of these challenges and these conversations. It's also very, very challenging and in many cases probably inappropriate for people to go into other communities and start trying to scold folks on the practices that are normative in those contexts. Right? And so I think that you could engage, you could offer insights, and there again, I've said this elsewhere, and I think there is a very delicate art to these sorts of conversations, and it's important to always carry a critical mind and that critical skill set. Right? Because on the inverse is also true. You could go work with a community, and if you're not problematizing some of the things that you're seeing, some of the exclusions that you're seeing, those sorts of things, you could actually legitimate the governance practices in my role, right, of a community that's actually causing harm, right, to women or gender diverse folks within the community. Academics have the power and the capital to legitimate what they're seeing, and so it is, again, it's always about finding a balance. It's not easy work, and again, goes back to why there's such a strong need for contextuality, because there's no playbook. And articulate various, a vision of truth. I say a vision of truth because there's many truths, right? And to acknowledge that people might all experience things differently, but as true in their own way. Alternate forms of meaning making, world creating, and imagining. And yes, we've already gone through, the sort of range of methodologies that people are utilizing, the range of approaches, the range of ways of talking. It's, also important to recognize that within particular cultural communities, feelings, words, insights are articulated in different sort of textual modes as well, right? Writing might look differently. So when I'm editing work, from a variety of different communities, I'm editor of the Native American Indigenous Studies Association Journal with Heidi Stark, my colleague at the University of Victoria. I tend to really defer to people's own stylistic preferences because often they're actually representative of a deeper politic or location. We just put together a special issue on Palestine with 14 research articles. And it was quite the undertaking because of the diversity of styles that became clear to me. I usually work with Native American Indigenous Studies scholars. We had a number of contributions from Palestinian authors, and it was very quick for us. What didn't take long for us to realize there's a very distinctive style here in terms of how people are writing. And my preference is to leave the style intact, because I think it's an imprint of people's politic, people's mode of articulation. They're choosing to represent what they're trying to get across in that way, and so to give them that agency also in the form of writing, right? Because we can reproduce these sorts of dynamics, again, the sort of scholarly expectations of form, of text within our own practices without even, really reflecting on them. And so that's just another example of, how I think feminists particularly often kind of push back against the rules of language and text. And I think, working in relation to that, with bringing a feminist commitment to that means recognizing and taking that seriously as knowledge in and of itself, right? It doesn't have to be reshaped to suit the sort of contours or parameters that we're used to seeing. There's the indigeneity, there's a race component, but Indigenous feminism, being attentive to land as it is. Yeah, so we talked about how Indigenous feminism is always attentive also to histories of land theft and oppression, right? The denial of identity, the way in which one's story is taken from them and misrepresented. So an Indigenous feminist reading is absolutely critical of the way that land figures and actually seeks to recenter a different story of land, right? One where the land in that region is supposed to be shared and governed by treaty, not a knight sort of protecting their individual fortress from trespass or the inevitable terror that's posed by Indigenous presence in this rural, very white space, right? And so when I was working on the case of Gerald Stanley, and part of what you're always doing as an academic is you're saying, okay, I'm going to look at this case, but how do I bring across and integrate some of my own commitments into this when they're not perhaps immediately apparent, right? When you compare the two cases of Tina Fontaine and Colton Boushie, absolutely, the media portrayals are rife. Like you can undertake a gendered analysis of how Fontaine gets hypersexualized and Boushie gets hypercriminalized, right? Because he's a man, an Indigenous youth, really. But these are some of the ways in which indigeneity has always been policed and regulated and targeted for elimination, right? Women through hypersexualization and men through criminality. But also, you could juxtapose a feminist approach can juxtapose an entirely different story. Like you were saying, Andre, right? There's this whole story that builds momentum and this narrative that builds around the castle and around the relationship with land. And suddenly the whole jury is fixated on that, right? That narrative of what it would feel like to be in your own home and have someone come into your home trespassing, causing all sorts of turmoil and this really vague language. I think they often use the language of, it was like waking up in the middle of a nightmare, this sort of nightmare encounter. What sort of white rural Saskatchewan farmer would want to see a Native youth arrive on his property, right? And so these sorts of narratives obviously resonate with an all-white jury. But if you were to offer a feminist account of this, for me, it was actually thinking not just about the most immediate parts of their identity, right? They're both these men, but what are the relationships with land that are being invoked here, right? And who is supposed to actually have authority over those tracts of land? What would the account look like if you were centering treaty? But also, how are these men sort of represented in archetypical, is that even a word, frames, right? This righteous farmer who's undertaking, he's literally building a fence, working towards his version of a good life, and is, interrupted. He's also represented his grown son, who's older than Colton, right, is repeatedly represented just through the language of his son. Oh, this man was protecting his family and his son. This man was concerned about his wife, right? Just undertaking that normal sort of, within that depiction, that sort of normative drive to protect one's own home and their nuclear family, right? But nobody is kind of reversing that account and talking about the youth there as experiencing joy and traversing their traditional territories that their families have lived in for hundreds of years, right? That have deeply rooted ancestral relationships with those places. So you look at the language that's being used to humanize the Stanleys, to humanize the wife, the son, who is a grown adult, right? And then the ways in which Colton gets just represented repeatedly as this sort of delinquent. They tried in the trial to have an unrelated liquor store robbery that had occurred like days earlier admitted into evidence to try and build a narrative of this roller coaster ride that these youth must have been engaged in throughout that time period, right? And ultimately, you know, had a bunch of challenges in trying to admit that. But what they were trying to build was a narrative around Colton, not as a son, as a brother, as a cousin, as someone who has legitimacy in those spaces, but as this criminal youth, citing other sort of criminal activities that he hadn't even been involved in, but that had marked the region, right? Other robberies, other, you know, instances of Indigenous people entering farmyards for directions or, you know, looking for help with a broken vehicle. And of course, Gerald Stanley was a mechanic, right? So a big part of why the youth said they were on that farm that day was to get help with their flat tire. Their vehicle was no longer mobile. But so this was just an example in the work that I've done of how sometimes, you know, you have to kind of extend those commitments and your analysis beyond what's immediately apparent to you. Like immediately, there wasn't necessarily a form to a feminist analysis, but interrogating treatments of family, treatments of land, treatments of the relations that figured centrally in the trial and in the narratives, what sort of archetypes were being relied on, what sort of concepts and assumptions of the good life, of a family home, of a frontier, a little mini farm frontier, right? What concepts are being invoked that are so illustrative and resonant for that jury? That was how I tried to kind of weave in a feminist analysis. Those who are situated with that privilege easily do not see it. And this is why a lot of Indigenous feminist approaches and practices are geared towards literally just illuminating or revealing power relations that many of us know too well to exist, right? These are stories we've heard over and over again. But actually many in Canada are oblivious to it, and generally those that have, you know, the privilege associated with it. Yeah, and in this case, just to extend, you know, the explanation of what actually transpires in the court is it ends up boiling down to whether Stanley that day, was he being responsible with a gun? No, they acknowledge he wasn't. They never actually proved that a hang fire occurred or could occur either, but they acknowledge in the case, no, he was not ultimately handling the gun responsibly. But what the question that the jury ends up being tasked with is, were the actions he undertook that day, given the nightmarish circumstances he was facing, were they those that a reasonable person could be expected to take? So they asked the jury to put themselves in this very particular narrative. Put yourself in Jerry's boots, I think they said. And if you were faced with that terror that day, while you're being expected to protect your son and wife, did he take actions that significantly departed from what a reasonable person could be expected to take, right? And so in that sense, because of all the context they had painted around, you know, it takes too long for the RCMP to get out to rural context, blah, 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 it was seen as reasonable for him to take up that level of violence, to take it into his own hands, and to exercise that. Now, can you imagine if they tried to mount a counter argument around Colton taking up that level of violence? You know, if the situation were reversed against intruders in his treaty territories, these chronic settler intruders that just won't go away and are irresponsible? Absolutely not, right? Because that's not what the police force, the legal system was designed in Canada to do. Stanley was just seen as carrying out what they were incapable of doing given their remoteness. And this was also where our gendered analysis came in this book, is then we took apart the notion of the reasonable person being based on the rational man and those sorts of angles as well. And so again, like kind of deconstructed some of the concepts that were relied upon rather than, you know, being able to look directly head on and saying, this was a case of, you know what I mean? Like, here's where the gender violence occurred. Rather, it was looking at those systems of power and their inner operations and how they collide with one another. Yeah. That wasn't happening, preemptively in a way that could have protected, them from the violence of these encounters. Yeah, absolutely. So that self-reflection comes when it's too late, or that in-depth reflection and critical reflection comes after the memorialization after the fact, right? And we see this with residential school inquiries and with, the bodies being uncovered, which Indigenous people knew about those bodies forever. Like, always have known about those bodies. Yeah, I remember decades ago, my wish of being like, there's bodies from residential school. There, and they've never looked at those sites. People knew where children were buried, right? But they only become sort of legible once there's this material evidence. But yes, I think you're raising a good point that indigeneity, again, it's not just this sort of murderable Indian, but also the memorialization of indigeneity has a certain sort of currency in terms of how indigeneity can be engaged, right? Absolutely, yeah. And even we see that it works, right? Like across disciplines where people will often think of, integrating Indigenous components as bringing in Indigenous, residential school survivors to kind of share their trauma. And I think that's one important dimension of Canada's history, but they're not always as comfortable bringing in, Indigenous people who are thriving and talking about the various, forms of joy and, theory and creative work that are being undertaken in the world around us, right? That's not as legible. They want often what audiences want, particular audiences, again, this changes across disciplines, is this sort of, damaged person who's going to share about their trauma rather than, offering perhaps an advanced intellectual engagement or something like that within the discipline, right? There's certain types of indigeneity that are definitely more legible. It would be great to incorporate that into cultural, acumen training and cultural learning, right? When groups are, undertaking these things, it is about learning the very violent histories of colonialism, but it's also learning about the ways that Indigenous people, indigeneity sort of functions and is held together now and into the future at a community level. What are practices of visiting, right? What is joy and humor and laughter? How does that figure, and what function does that serve socially, politically, dialogically? Like, what are some of these qualities and characteristics of indigeneity today? Again, sort of moving away from damage-centered work and towards more world-building, future-oriented orientations. And that's where I think actually a lot of the work being done by Indigenous feminists and queer studies scholars in particular is taking us, right? It's pointing us to the ways in which, it's not either damage or future world building. It can be both of those things, right? It can be and instead of or, right? And so often we are grappling, right? We are grappling with these ongoing wounds, these forms of violence we're seeing in the world all around us, but at the same time are also forging relationships, sites of community, new forms of working together and finding joy in our interactions and, producing creative works that are going to be inspiring for future generations as well. But that's the work that excites me the most, and a lot of it is being put forward by Indigenous youth, queer scholars, and non-binary and two-spirit scholars today in very creative formats that are being seen as kind of adjuncts for political life and governance, or where they're drawing out the political significance of affect, let's say, of desire, of sexuality, and so on and so on. And so our time is drawing close. I did have one more slide about your own work, but I think you could just take away some of these questions, and we won't necessarily have time to go through them all today, just because this conversation has actually been so involved and in-depth. Thank you so much for your engagement, and your willingness to undertake the conversation. But I think, similar to my description of how I work to try and think through what a feminist analysis could mean, even in an indirect way with that case, think about and think back to the opening prompt or what your work is, right? Many of you, the resonance with indigeneity and with gender and sexuality and feminism was very clear, and it sounds like you've already mapped that out. But for those of you that have a more tangential kind of or adjacent relationship with indigeneity or with feminism or gender or sexuality, what does your work do? So again, going back to that old adage, feminism is not an armchair preoccupation, right? It's transformative, it's directed at praxis, it's directed at social change. What does it do? What is it going to achieve? Right? Is it going to help illuminate colonial or racialized or sexualized gender dynamics? Is it going to try and confront some tensions? Is it going to confront the status quo? Right? We've talked a lot about how the status quo, or things that are sort of circulating in normative ways, need to actively be interrupted and illuminated so people can see them, right? So is it going to involve a sense of complaint or some sort of disruption over and against something else? Think about how you might bring Indigenous feminism to your work. Think about your own work, either scholarly, political, or personal, and how you might bring Indigenous feminism into it. And again, just some prompts about, is there something you want to disrupt, or is there something else that you might envision that you want to bring across or bring forward, right? What are we trying to create that can also inform our own pedagogy and our methods and approaches? Who do you want it to speak to? And these are just a sample of questions. The list goes on and on and on. But I think, unless there's any last reflections or last questions, I'll leave it there, because we are getting close to time, and I actually had a lot more that I was going to just rant about in terms of the Academy today, in typical style of Indigenous feminists. But I really appreciate everything that you've brought to the table about sharing about your own experiences and insights and perspectives. So thank you for filling the space in such a rich way. Thank you.